January 1986, Milltown, Ohio, a small rural town surrounded by frozen fields where winter snow pressed down on every road and rooftop. Nights were quiet. Streets were nearly empty by 9 o'clock. Among the few who stayed active late was Pastor Michael Harris. At 32, he was young for a church leader. He stood out not only for his sermons but for his determination. He had spent the past 2 years urging farmers to resist the mafia crews who demanded protection money. His words carried risk, and everyone knew it. He didn't seem to care. He spoke openly, even when it angered the wrong people. On the night of January 17th, Michael hosted a meeting at St. Luke's Church. It wasn't just a religious service. It was also a place where struggling families gathered, hoping someone would stand beside them. Several people later recalled that Michael was more intense than usual. He spoke about fear, about silence, and about how silence only gave power to those who exploited the town. By 9 o'clock, the church began to empty. People wrapped their coats tight, stepping out into the freezing night. Michael was the last to leave. He told one member he planned to stop by the home of an older parishioner before heading back. At around 9:15, the headlights of his Chevy Nova were seen pulling away from the church lot. That was the last confirmed sighting of him alive. The following morning, January 18th, a local farmer spotted a car on the edge of a snowy road just outside town. The headlights were still on. The driver's door was cracked open. It was Michael's Chevy. Police arrived quickly. Inside the vehicle, they found his heavy winter coat draped on the passenger seat. A Bible rested on the dashboard, pages marked and underlined. A leather notebook lay on the floorboard. In it were names of local families and details of who had been threatened by mafia collectors. The ignition key was still in place. The gas tank was half full. There were no signs of forced entry or theft. His wallet, papers, and watch were untouched. Investigators stepped out onto the snow. Just beyond the car were footprints. Michael's boots pressed deep into the frozen surface. The trail led away from the road out toward an open field. The sheriff's office cordoned off the area. Search teams with dogs swept the fields. The canines picked up Michael's scent, but lost it quickly along the tree line. No further trail could be found. By mid-afternoon, news of the vanishing spread across Milltown. Families whispered the same conclusion. This had to be connected to the mafia. Michael had been too outspoken, too fearless, and too willing to challenge them in public. The church bulletin boards were plastered with flyers. Radio stations repeated the headline, "Local pastor vanishes on winter night." The notebook left behind only fueled speculation. Why was he carrying such detailed notes about extortion victims? Was he planning to confront the mafia with evidence? Or had someone already found out what he was documenting? Investigators kept open several lines of inquiry. One theory was that Michael had staged his own disappearance, fearing retaliation. But his family immediately rejected it. His sister insisted he would never abandon his congregation. Others suspected a police cover-up, since Michael had often accused local officers of turning a blind eye to corruption. As hours turned into days, the case only grew stranger. Searchers combed the frozen fields for miles. Helicopters scanned the snowy landscape. Nothing was found. The disappearance seemed to have occurred in a narrow window, just minutes after Michael had pulled his car to the roadside. In that brief space of time, he had stepped away from his vehicle and vanished into the darkness. The town was left shaken. For a rural community where people rarely locked their doors, the sudden loss of a pastor was devastating. His absence wasn't just personal. It symbolized the danger of speaking against the powerful. Police held nightly briefings but could not present solid evidence. No fingerprints, no fibers, no witnesses who had seen the exact moment Michael disappeared. They had a stalled investigation, only 24 hours in. The unanswered questions weighed heavily. Why did his footprints end abruptly in the snow? Why was his car left with the lights on? And what did the faint smudge on the driver's side door mean? An accident? Or a sign of contact with another person? The community demanded answers, but none were given. By the end of the first week, there was still no trace of Michael Harris. His disappearance set the stage for a case that would haunt Ohio for decades. A case that raised suspicion against friends, neighbors, and even local law enforcement. What began as a quiet January night had become the beginning of one of the state's most chilling mysteries. And as we move forward, we'll look closer at the crime scene itself, the search that followed, and the first wave of suspicion that would divide the town. If you're following this case, tell us what detail strikes you the most about Michael's disappearance. Could a man really vanish in just a few minutes on a snowy roadside? Share your thoughts below as we move to the next chapter. The next morning, January 18th, 1986, Milltown woke up to snow piled on every street. It was just another bitter winter day in rural Ohio, until a farmer driving to town noticed something strange on the roadside. A dark Chevy Nova sat idling at the edge of a field, its headlights still burned through the fog. The driver's door was left slightly open, the engine cold, as if the car had been abandoned hours earlier. When deputies arrived, they quickly realized the car belonged to Pastor Michael Harris. Inside, they found his heavy wool coat folded across the passenger seat, his Bible resting on top, and a worn notebook filled with names and notes about local farmers, many of them people who had been pressured or threatened by the mafia. Everything was in place: the wallet, the documents, the car keys. Nothing suggested a robbery. Yet the man who drove that car was gone. The first clear piece of evidence lay just beyond the vehicle: boot prints pressed deep into the snow. Investigators matched the sole pattern to a pair of boots that Michael was known to wear. To widen the search, officers brought in dogs. The canine unit sniffed the inside of the car, picked up Michael's scent, and followed it into the field. Just like the footprints, the trail came to an abrupt end at the edge of the open space. The dogs circled, pawed at the snow, but refused to move forward. To investigators, the explanation was obvious. Somewhere out there in the dark, another vehicle had pulled up. Michael Harris must have been forced or led inside, leaving no further trace. As word spread, a few residents came forward with accounts from the previous night. Several claimed they had seen a van passing along that same stretch of road, a boxy, dark-colored vehicle, possibly green or blue. It had side windows, maybe curtains, but the license plate was impossible to read through the snowfall. Nobody saw it stop. Nobody could describe who was inside. Still, the report of a suspicious van became the first official lead. Almost immediately, whispers turned into accusations. People in Milltown believed the mafia had made its move. They wanted to shut him up, one farmer told reporters. It didn't take long for the press to seize the story. The Cleveland Plain Dealer ran a headline: "Pastor vanishes after confronting local mafia." Local radio repeated it all day. The framing was clear. Michael Harris had spoken out too loudly, and he had paid the price. But others raised a darker possibility. Some in town remembered how Michael had openly condemned Sheriff Collins, accusing him of ignoring the suffering of farmers and allowing the mafia to operate unchecked. After the disappearance, more than a few began to question whether the sheriff's office was compromised. "If the police wanted this case buried," one man told investigators, "what better way than to make it look like the mafia did it?" For Michael's family, there was no doubt. His sister insisted he would never walk away from his people. He would never leave on his own. Parishioners echoed her words. They had seen him rally the community again and again, never backing down from threats. The church congregation pushed the authorities to escalate the investigation, demanding that the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation step in. With the spotlight now on Milltown, the media dug. The pressure on investigators grew unbearable. Within the first week, the sheriff's department had conducted multiple sweeps of the field and surrounding woods. They brought in volunteers, combed the frozen ditches, and even dragged parts of the nearby river. Nothing surfaced. No weapon, no body. Not a single piece of fabric or jewelry that might confirm what had happened after Michael left his car. The lack of progress made the mystery even more haunting. How could a man step out of his vehicle, walk less than 30 steps into the snow, and disappear without a trace? How could there be no struggle, no cry for help heard, no trail of evidence leading away from that lonely stretch of road? By the end of the first week, the official report was grim. Michael Harris was now listed as a high-risk missing person, likely the victim of an abduction. But without a body, the case remained in limbo. Investigators had no crime scene, no weapon, no clear suspects. Only a car left running in the dark, footprints that stopped short, and a town filled with rumors. The frozen crime scene had given them fragments, but not a single piece big enough to hold together. For Michael's family and his community, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch on for years. And for investigators, it was the first sign that this case would not be solved quickly. As we move forward, the story shifts from the frozen field to the people left behind. The town of Milltown would be shaken to its core. Fear spread through the farms and streets, and soon suspicion began to tear the community apart. In the next chapter, we'll see how panic, rumor, and distrust shaped the investigation, and how innocent people became targets of blame. Before we continue, I want to hear your thoughts. What do you think about the frozen field, the van, and the footprints that ended in the snow? Could it have been a planned abduction? Or was it a confrontation gone wrong? Share your theories in the comments, and let's see what you make of this strange and chilling scene. Milltown was never the same after Pastor Michael Harris vanished. The town was small, quiet, and tightly knit. People trusted each other. Doors were often left unlocked. Farmers who had once drawn strength from Michael's fiery sermons began to hesitate. For a brief moment, they felt empowered. Some refused to pay the protection money, daring to believe that Michael's stand against the mafia might change the balance. But the defiance did not last. Within weeks, intimidation returned. Barn doors were broken into, equipment was smashed, crops stored for the winter were ruined. The message was clear: silence was survival. Many farmers reluctantly resumed their payments, their courage drowned out by fear. The church became the center of both hope and grief. Inside St. Luke, Michael's portrait was placed at the altar, surrounded by candles that flickered every night. Parishioners gathered in long rows, heads bowed, their prayers heavy and desperate. Some came for faith, others simply for the comfort of being together. Each gathering was a mix of devotion and dread. People clutched. Rumors shifted the town's mood from fear to suspicion. Some whispered that Michael had been taken out of state, kept somewhere against his will. Others pointed to people who had argued with him. Old disagreements over debts or land turned into gossip-fueled accusations. Families who had clashed with Michael over church matters suddenly found themselves isolated, their children bullied at school, their names dragged through whispers at the market. The town that once stood together was fracturing. Michael's family refused to remain quiet. His younger sister organized small marches through the town square, holding signs that read, "Justice for Michael." Dozens of townspeople joined at first, but the crowds shrank as weeks turned into months. The mafia's shadow loomed over every effort. People who marched risked being noticed, and in Milltown, being noticed could bring danger. The Harris family pushed on, but exhaustion showed in their faces. They were grieving while also fighting a battle that felt impossible. The press kept the case alive, though not always in the way the family hoped. The local paper published headline after headline, "Pastor still missing," and "Is mafia behind it?" Radio hosts speculated on air, spinning theories to fill the silence of a case going nowhere. Coverage kept the disappearance in the spotlight, but it also deepened the unease. Fear fed circulation, and circulation fed more fear. In coffee shops and diners, the conversation never strayed far from the same grim subject. As spring approached, reality settled over Milltown. Months had passed, yet no breakthrough had come. The search teams stopped going out every weekend. The tip line went quiet. The candles still burned at St. Luke, but fewer people attended the vigils. Hope was fading, replaced by resignation. By summer, the disappearance of Michael Harris was no longer just an investigation. It was a warning written into the daily lives of everyone in Milltown. People spoke less. They trusted less. The town had learned the cost of speaking out. The mafia didn't have to prove its power anymore. Michael's absence did it for them. The Harris family continued to push forward, but they felt increasingly alone. Their marches drew fewer supporters. Their calls for justice met with sympathetic nods, but little action. Behind closed doors, townspeople admitted what everyone knew. Milltown had been silenced, not only by violence, but by fear itself. Michael's case had already become something larger than one man's disappearance. It had become a shadow over the town, a constant reminder of how quickly safety could crumble. The mafia didn't just control through money or fists. They ruled through silence. And now Milltown had fallen quiet. As the months rolled on, the investigation drifted without direction. And for many, the painful truth began to sink in. The pastor who had once given them courage might never return. His absence was no longer just about what had happened that night. It was about what it left behind: fear, suspicion, and a community torn apart. The investigation turned toward a man many in Milltown already whispered about. His name was Thomas Blake, a 40-year-old farmer who lived on the edge of town. His family had been in the corn business for generations, but years of bad harvests and the pressure of the mafia's extortion. Police called Thomas in for questioning. He was interrogated for hours. Officers noted his defensive posture, his angry tone, his refusal to stay calm. To them, he looked guilty. When they pressed about the argument at the church, he admitted it had happened, but denied ever wishing Michael harm. His answers were messy, his frustration obvious, and that only fueled suspicion. Investigators searched his property. They combed through his fields and barns looking for signs of violence. They collected boot prints from the mud and compared them to the tracks found near Michael's car. Early reports suggested they looked similar, but forensic testing ruled them out. The prints didn't match. Still, the cloud of suspicion didn't lift. For several days, Thomas remained the prime suspect. The community demanded his arrest. Parishioners and neighbors whispered that the pastor's blood was on his hands. Parents told their children to stay away from his farm. Every aspect of his life came under the microscope. His debt, his temper, his connections to loan sharks, his heated argument with Michael. To the town, the story fit too neatly to ignore. Then came the turning point. Investigators uncovered an alibi Thomas could not have faked. On the night of January 17th, the night Pastor Michael disappeared, Thomas's wife went into labor. Hospital records confirmed it. Nurses and doctors gave sworn statements. Thomas had been by his wife's side for the entire night. Delivery logs, timestamps, and signatures all backed it up. There was no possible way he could have left, abducted Michael, and returned unnoticed. The evidence was ironclad. The sheriff's office cleared him. Officially, Thomas Blake was no longer a suspect. But outside the station walls, Milltown refused to accept it. To the community, facts no longer mattered. Once the rumor had attached itself to his name, it became truth in the eyes of many. Life for Thomas and his family unraveled. Neighbors stopped buying corn from him. At the general store, people turned their backs when he walked in. Children at school taunted his son and daughter, calling them the pastor's killers. Within a few years, the financial and social pressure broke him. Unable to recover, Thomas lost his farm. The bank repossessed his land. His family packed what little they had left and left Milltown behind. He faded from the town's daily life, but the stigma followed him wherever he went. For many, Thomas Blake was not the farmer who lost everything. He was the man they always suspected of silencing Pastor Michael Harris. Years later, when new evidence would emerge that proved mafia involvement, Thomas's name would never fully recover. The town didn't rush to apologize. His reputation remained scarred, a permanent reminder of what fear and rumor could do. His story became a tragic lesson within a larger tragedy. How quickly suspicion can destroy a man, even when the facts prove otherwise. He was the first in a line of innocent people whose lives were ruined because of one disappearance. The weight of community fear, the spread of gossip, and the eagerness to find someone to blame turned him into a villain that never existed. The case of Pastor Michael Harris wasn't just about a man who vanished. It became about the people who were crushed under the weight of an unsolved crime. Thomas Blake stood as the first example. He was never charged, never convicted, but his life ended as if he had been. As the investigation dragged on, more names would be pulled into the same spiral of rumor and accusation. Thomas wasn't the last. Others would follow, each one marked as guilty in the eyes of Milltown. And yet, the true answers remained hidden. Sheriff William Collins had been the head of law enforcement in Milltown for more than 15 years. At 52, he was a familiar face, a man whose name carried weight in every corner of the small Ohio town. But for many residents, that name carried something else: suspicion. Whispers had long followed him. People said he looked the other way when the mafia made their rounds, collecting money from farmers. Some believed he even took bribes to stay quiet. Michael Harris, the young pastor who dared to speak out against organized crime, had not ignored these rumors. The local press wasted no time. The headline in the Milltown Gazette asked, "Was the sheriff protecting the mafia?" Radio hosts fanned the flames. On morning talk shows, callers speculated. "He knew too much. The sheriff got rid of him." The narrative spread quickly. People didn't see Collins as the law anymore. They saw him as the man who let criminals thrive. And now, they wondered if he had gone further, if he had silenced the pastor himself. The pressure was too much for local police to handle. The state stepped in. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation launched a review. Collins was interrogated like any other suspect. Investigators combed through his schedule from the night of January 17th. They examined the sheriff's office logs, checked the duty roster, and questioned every deputy who had been on shift. 3 employees confirmed that Collins had been in the office the entire night. He had signed paperwork, taken calls, and never left his desk. Forensic teams went further. They searched his patrol car, his home, his office. They swabbed for traces of blood, fibers, anything that might connect him to the Chevy Nova or to Michael himself. The results came back clean. Nothing linked the sheriff to the disappearance. On paper, his alibi was airtight. He had the logs, the staff testimony, and the paperwork to prove it. But the town didn't believe it. Many residents dismissed the evidence as nothing more than a cover-up. They insisted that colleagues had protected their boss. They said the paperwork could be faked. They argued that even if Collins had stayed in the office, it didn't mean he hadn't ordered someone else to do the job for him. The suspicion clung to him like a shadow. Collins tried to defend himself. At a press conference, he said firmly, "I did not harm Pastor Harris. I had nothing to do with his disappearance." But his words fell flat. In Milltown, perception mattered more than fact. People had already made up their minds. To them, the sheriff had a motive, and that was enough. As months passed with no progress in the case, pressure mounted. The town council began questioning his leadership. The state convened a hearing, and Collins was called to testify. He repeated his alibi, pointed to the evidence, and denied every accusation. But the room was filled with doubt. Spectators glared at him as though they were looking at the man responsible for their pastor's death. The impact reached his family. His children were bullied at school, called mafia kids by their classmates. His wife stopped attending social events. They became targets of gossip, a family under siege. The sheriff's badge no longer represented authority. It represented betrayal. 1 year after Michael's disappearance, Collins announced his resignation. He said it was because he had lost the trust of the community. The truth was simpler. He no longer had the ability to lead. His credibility was gone. He left Milltown in quiet disgrace. No formal charges had ever been filed against him. The investigation had found nothing. But the damage was irreversible. For the rest of his life, his name would be tied to the case. Wherever he went, he carried the weight of that suspicion. People introduced him not as a former sheriff, but as the man who had once been accused of being tied to the mafia. In Milltown, the rumors never stopped. Some said he had orchestrated the entire crime. Others claimed he had simply looked the other way. Even as years passed, long after Collins had left, his name remained one of the town's favorite theories. The collapse of his career showed how powerful rumor and distrust could be. It didn't matter that evidence cleared him. It didn't matter that his alibi was backed by multiple witnesses. The court of public opinion had ruled him guilty. In Milltown, people clung to the idea that the sheriff had betrayed them, because the question lingered, heavy and unanswered. Had Michael been taken by the mafia, as so many believed, or was there something darker, something involving the very people sworn to protect the town? For Milltown, it didn't matter that the sheriff was never charged. In their minds, he would always be the suspect that got away. In every small town, there are names that carry weight. Michael Harris was one of them. And in Milltown, so was another name, but for all the wrong reasons. Jimmy Russo. Jimmy was only 19 when Michael vanished. Born and raised in Milltown, he had dropped out of school young, drifting from odd jobs to late nights on the streets. He hung around with older boys already tied loosely to the mafia. Sometimes he followed them when they made their rounds at local farms collecting protection fees. He never had the power, but his presence was enough to make people uncomfortable. By the time Michael disappeared, Jimmy already carried the label of the town troublemaker. People called him reckless, angry, the type of kid who would end up in prison one day. His name had been whispered for years in connection with vandalism, fights, and petty theft. When a respected pastor suddenly went missing, Jimmy became the easiest target for suspicion. Michael himself had drawn that line in public. On more than one Sunday, he had singled Jimmy out by name from the pulpit, telling the congregation that young men like him were helping criminals crush their own neighbors. "You scare old farmers," he said once, "because you don't have the courage to stand against the men who use you." Those words stung, and they stuck. There was another scene, even louder. At the town market, Jimmy had confronted an elderly farmer over unpaid money. Michael intervened, putting himself between them. Dozens of people witnessed it. The pastor shamed Jimmy right there in the open. For a boy already off, for a boy already written off by the town, it sealed his reputation. So when Michael Harris vanished in January 1986, Milltown didn't hesitate. At coffee shops, at diners, inside barns and tractor sheds, people whispered the same name. It was Russo. That boy finally went too far. In a town terrified of the mafia, the easy story was that the troubled teen had done their dirty work. The problem was, the entire town was already convinced. To them, the arrest felt like confirmation. But facts told a different story. Jimmy had been working the night shift at a local machine shop on the very night Michael disappeared. His time card showed him punching in at 6 p.m. and out at 2 a.m. Several co-workers vouched for him, saying he never left the shop floor. It wasn't shaky testimony, it was solid. After 48 hours in custody, police had no choice but to let him go. On paper, Jimmy was cleared. In reality, he was condemned. The release didn't change minds. In Milltown, once suspicion took root, it didn't let go. People crossed the street when they saw him. Farmers muttered that he had simply gotten away with it. His parents were dragged into the mess, treated as if they had raised a criminal capable of killing a pastor. At school, his younger siblings were mocked as the mafia kids. Jimmy's life unraveled fast. Within months, he left Milltown entirely, moving from one small town to another, trying to shake the shadow of the case. But the name followed him. Whenever news stories about Michael resurfaced, so did the whispers. Each anniversary vigil reminded people of the pastor's disappearance, and reminded Jimmy of the town that had decided he was guilty. He lived like a man without a home, drifting from job to job, trying to outrun a reputation he never deserved. He wasn't the only one. His family carried the stain too. One brother left Ohio completely, starting over in another state. His mother stopped attending church because the stairs were unbearable. The tragedy of Jimmy Russo was that he never stood trial, never saw a courtroom, never faced evidence, because there was none. And yet his punishment was real, lasting, and absolute. He was exiled not by law but by suspicion. Years later, when the case finally broke and DNA evidence pointed to real members of the mafia, Jimmy's name was technically cleared. But by then, the damage was irreversible. His youth was gone. His choices were shaped by the exile that Milltown had forced on him. He would never recover what the town had taken: his name, his future. And so, Milltown lost two men to that winter night: the pastor who disappeared, and the troubled teen who never recovered from the accusation. By early 1987, the case had gone as far as it could. Investigators had followed every lead, checked every rumor, and searched every corner of Milltown's frozen fields. Nothing new emerged. No witnesses, no evidence, no break. The file was formally closed that winter, stamped and moved into the cold case cabinet at the state office. On paper, it was reduced to a single line: missing person, suspected foul play. In reality, it was a wound that refused to heal. For Michael's family and the people of St. Luke's Church, silence was not the end. Each January, they returned to the pews with candles in hand. They gathered around the altar where his portrait stood, framed in black, lit by the soft glow of prayer candles. They read scripture, they prayed for truth, and they whispered his name in a way that made it clear he was still present, even if his body was not. For the community, those vigils became their only form of resistance. Against the snow, against the mafia, against despair itself, the light of those candles meant hope. But year after year, the hope grew weaker. Local reporters kept the case alive, but even that came at a cost. Every few months, a headline appeared: "The Milltown Mystery. Where is Pastor Harris?" Each time, the story reminded the town not of answers, but of failure. Writers focused on what was missing, on how law enforcement had stumbled, and on how the mafia's shadow seemed untouchable. Regional stations picked it up too, but interest faded. Without evidence, without progress, stories became recycled echoes of the same unanswered questions. The media fed fear, but it could not provide truth. Meanwhile, rumors in Milltown took on a life of their own. Some insisted that Michael had been silenced and dumped into the Ohio River. Others swore he was still alive, hidden away in a cabin far outside town, maybe chained. The three men once accused, Thomas Blake, Sheriff Collins, and Jimmy Russo, carried the heaviest burden. Each had been cleared by fact, but not by rumor. Their names were still dragged out in cafes, at markets, in hushed tones at church gatherings. A farmer ruined, a sheriff disgraced, a teenager cast out. They were innocent, but innocence had no power against suspicion. The community had made them permanent shadows of the case. Every time someone mentioned Pastor Harris, their names followed. Life in Milltown moved forward, but the air never felt the same. People went back to farming, to work, to routine, but they carried with them a quiet understanding. If even a pastor could vanish on a road they all drove, then safety was an illusion. Every winter, when snow covered the fields where Michael's boot prints had once ended abruptly, the silence of that night returned. To walk past that road was to remember. The headlights left on. The door left ajar. The footsteps that stopped mid-field as if the man himself had vanished into the dark. As time passed, people stopped expecting justice. They told themselves the mafia had won. They told themselves the truth was buried forever. For many, it was easier to believe Michael was gone for good than to cling to hope that only deepened the wound. In coffee shops, people avoided his name. In town meetings, no one dared bring it up. The case was no longer an open discussion. It was a shadow that hung over Milltown, spoken of rarely, felt always. The story of Pastor Harris became not just a mystery, but a lesson in fear. The mafia didn't need to kill every man who opposed them. They only needed to prove that even someone as visible, as brave, as untouchable as a pastor could be silenced, and that no one would pay the price. The silence that followed became the strongest weapon of all. And so the case sat frozen, a closed file in a dusty cabinet, a row of candles in a church every January, a town divided by doubt, suspicion, and fear. Milltown carried on, but beneath the surface it was broken. And until the day science caught up with secrets, it seemed the truth had died on that road with
The evidence clerk signs the chain of custody form. The door panel swab, sealed and brittle with age, heads to a modern lab in Columbus. Scientists run a careful extraction. They set controls, amplify the sample, and watch a short ladder of peaks rise on the screen. It is a profile. It is not the pastor's. It is a man unknown to the original investigation. The result is clean enough to upload. The profile goes into the national database and waits. The team does not wait. They reopen everything. They cross-check the Chevy's logs, the field search maps, the list of possible vans seen that night. They re-interview what witnesses are still around. Memories are thinner now, but one farmhand repeats the same point he told deputies back then. A dark van rolled past slow, windows filmed with frost. He remembers a dent near the taillight. He remembers the way the engine coughed. It is not enough for a warrant, but it fits the old thread. The lab pings the detectives in the summer of 2004. A hospital intake in Columbus produces a fresh DNA profile from a man treated after a bar stabbing. Booking and medical procedures put his sample straight into the system. The hit is immediate. The unknown stain from the Chevy Nova door matches him exactly. The name is familiar to organized crime units, a street enforcer tied loosely to protection crews who worked rural routes in the mid-'80s. He is older now, slower, and no longer on the rise. He is still dangerous. Detectives split into teams. One team secures a warrant and picks him up at his apartment. Another team knocks on old associates. A third tracks down phone records and payroll stubs from the mid-'80s, the sort of paperwork no one thinks will matter until it does. Back at the station, the suspect stares at a photo of the Chevy. He remembers the snow. He remembers the pastor's voice from the small-town radio stations that used to mock him and his crew. He does not speak for 2 hours. The evidence speaks first. The detectives lay out the DNA report. They explain the chain of custody from 1986 to now. They play a tape of a retired. The argument was quick and ugly. The pastor did not run. He told them the payments would stop. He told them the farmers were done. He told them to tell their boss to come say it to his face on Sunday if he had something to say. The younger man grabbed him by the sleeve. The older man pushed him. The pastor shoved back, hard. Snow made gravel into ice. A punch landed. A boot slipped. The pastor went down, and his head struck the packed ground. Silence settled under the wind. The suspect swallows hard and keeps talking. He says he saw the pastor's eyes fixed on the sky. He says he nudged his shoulder and got nothing. He says the older man cursed, checked for a pulse, and said they had to move him. The suspect opened the Chevy's trunk. Panic made them clumsy. His glove slipped on the door handle when he reached back to close it. Blood from a split knuckle streaked onto the metal. They wrapped the body in a stray moving blanket from their van and lifted. They did not drive to a river that night. They drove to an abandoned warehouse by the Ohio, a place their crew had used to store cheap liquor and busted slot machines. They pried up a loose set of boards and left the pastor there while they figured out what to do. The suspect says he did not sleep for 2 days. He says he waited for the radio to say "found safe." He says the old man told him to shut up and keep working collections like nothing happened. Detectives move to corroborate every line. A search warrant opens the warehouse, long condemned and set for redevelopment. Decay has swallowed almost everything, but floor joists show pry marks in the right spot. A cadaver dog alerts on old wood, soaked and long clean, the way time erases and still leaves a trace. Crime scene techs find fibers from a cheap gray moving blanket snared under broken nails along the hatch. The pattern matches fiber debris cataloged beside the pastor's remains when they were eventually recovered elsewhere. It is not dramatic. It is enough. They press on the second man, the uncle. He has moved twice and changed names once, but a DMV clerk helps confirm the alias from an old ticket and a lazy signature. Court opens to a full gallery. Milltown is driven in for the first time since the cold case label locked the file. Witnesses testify about the field, the prints, the frozen night. A retired deputy admits his frustration back then and his relief now. A lab analyst walks the jury through the peaks on the chart and how a tiny smear can connect decades. The suspect's recorded interview plays. His voice is hoarse. He does not sound like a mastermind. He sounds like a man who let a shove turn into a disappearance and then chose silence. The verdict lands in 2005. Both men are found guilty on charges that reflect their actions that night and the long concealment that followed. Sentencing comes with a line that cuts through the room. Without modern DNA, this cold case might have stayed a rumor. The judge notes the years lost to Milltown, the harm done to the families accused in error, and the way intimidation can warp a town's sense of what is possible. News travels fast beyond the county line. Stations across Ohio lead with the database match that cracked a dead end. Reporters stand in front of St. Luke in the snow-beaten field and repeat the steps. The car on the shoulder, the prints that stop, the stain on the door, the quiet lab in Columbus, the match in a hospital after a bar fight. Viewers understand the sequence. They also understand what it cost. Milltown hears the gavel and breathes, but not in relief alone. The discovery feels close and late at the same time. People who stopped talking about protection money start talking again, this time to help each other, not to gossip. Farmers who watched their fathers pay start drawing lines for their sons. The town keeps the hurt and carries the lesson. Science can finish a job courage began. The record now shows the path from a winter road to a courtroom, from a smear of blood no one trusted, to a profile no one could deny. The case file closes again, heavier than before. It returns to the shelf marked "Solved," and the space it leaves in Milltown's chest is strange. Justice arrived, but the years do not come back. For the Harris family, it was a moment of release and heartbreak. Michael's sister held tight to the old silver ring and the worn Bible that once belonged to him. These were the only pieces of him left to carry home. After years of silence, denial, and fear, the truth had finally been spoken out loud. Yet the price had been 20 years of pain. News of the verdict spread across Ohio. Evening broadcasts replayed the story of the small-town pastor who had stood up against the mafia and paid with his life. Reporters emphasized the role of DNA evidence that had unlocked the case. For many, it was a powerful reminder of what science could do. For Milltown, it was a wound reopened, but also, at last, a wound addressed. Not long after, Milltown held a public memorial. The town square filled with candles. Farmers, veterans, old church members, and even children who had only heard the story secondhand stood together. Hundreds of people read Michael's name aloud as it was carved into the town's memorial stone, right under the symbol of a cross. For a brief moment, Milltown was united again, no longer in silence, but in remembrance. During the service, Michael's sister spoke. Her voice was steady, but heavy with years of waiting. She said, "We waited almost 20 years to hear the truth. But the cost was too high. Justice came late, but at least it came." The family later donated Michael's Bible and personal items to St. Luke's Church. They wanted his sacrifice remembered not just in stone, but in the place where he had once inspired people to be brave. The reopening of the case also forced the state to confront its mistakes. The Ohio Bureau of Investigation issued a public apology, not just to the family, but to the men who had lived under suspicion for decades. Thomas Blake, the farmer who lost his land and reputation. Sheriff Collins, who lost his career and family's trust. And Jimmy Russo, the young man who spent half his life being whispered about as a killer. All three were named in a press conference where officials admitted the system had failed them. The apology was official. After years on the road, Jimmy built a small business, then expanded it. By the time the case was solved, he was a wealthy man. Yet instead of turning away, he returned to Milltown with a plan. He funded the construction of a new school, created scholarships for the children of farmers, and invested in community projects. The same town that once spat on his name now relied on his generosity. Still, the shadow followed him. Whenever the name Michael Harris was mentioned, Jimmy's name surfaced too. Always as part of the tragedy, never fully separate. For Milltown, the truth changed more than just one case. The town began holding regular community meetings to talk about security and cooperation. The grip of the mafia had already weakened by the early 2000s, but Michael's case became the turning point. People no longer wanted to hide behind silence. They wanted to reclaim their town. The state also created the Michael Harris Fund, designed to help families of cold case victims and provide resources for communities facing organized crime. Grants from the fund supported legal aid, counseling, and community policing. Michael's name, once only associated with fear, now became linked with protection and courage. Academics took note as well. The Harris case was added to criminal justice training programs across Ohio. It was taught as an example of why forensic evidence must never be overlooked, and why investigators cannot allow rumors or pressure from the public to dictate who becomes a suspect. In classrooms, his name became a lesson. The cost of ignoring science. The cost of following gossip instead of facts. For Milltown, life moved forward, but never without reminders. Every January, citizens gathered at St. Luke's Church, where his photograph remained by the altar. They lit candles not only for Michael, but for the town itself.
for its years of silence, its divisions, and its painful recovery. The tragedy also reshaped how people saw courage. Michael Harris was no longer just remembered as a pastor. He was remembered as the man who refused to be silent in the face of intimidation, who told farmers not to bow to criminals. And the truth came too late to save Michael. Too late to spare the innocent men who were falsely accused. Too late to prevent families from being torn apart. But it came, and for Milltown, that mattered. As the memorial stone in the town square caught the light of hundreds of candles, the people of Milltown knew they could not undo the past. But they could choose to remember. They could choose to honor the man who stood against corruption, even when it cost him everything. Michael Harris became more than a name on a file, more than a missing persons case, more than a symbol of failure. He became the reminder of what silence costs and what courage demands. Justice had arrived late, but it had arrived. Milltown stepped out from the shadow, not forgetting its years of fear, but carrying forward the name of the young pastor who had dared to stand up against the darkness. If you've followed Pastor Michael Harris's story until the end, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you think justice really came too late, or was it still worth the fight? Share your opinion in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more true crime stories, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next case we cover.